Dumping millions of squids into a dying body of water sounds like the setup to a bad joke. But in 2019, that's exactly what scientists started doing to the Salton Sea in California. And what happened next? Rewrote everything we thought we knew about ecosystem recovery. The sea was toxic, lifeless, and getting worse every year. 5 years later, the results are so unexpected that even the scientists involved are struggling to explain it. Let's dive in. First, we need to talk about what the Salton Sea actually is. Because calling it a sea is generous. It's more like California's biggest environmental disaster that nobody outside the state seems to know about. Sitting in the middle of the Colorado Desert, about 150 miles east of San Diego, the Salton Sea covers roughly 343 square miles. That makes it larger than Lake Tahoe. But unlike Tahoe, which is pristine and beautiful, the Salton Sea is a toxic mess that smells like rotten eggs and dead fish. Here's the wild part. The Salton Sea wasn't supposed to exist. It was created by accident in 1905, when engineers trying to divert Colorado River water for irrigation screwed up massively. The river broke through a canal headgate and flowed uncontrolled into the Salton Basin for 2 years. By the time they fixed it, there was a new sea sitting in the desert. Oops! For a while, this accident turned into a feature. By the 1950s and 60s, the Salton Sea was a resort destination. People called it the California Riviera. Celebrities showed up. Yacht clubs opened. Developers built entire communities around it. There were beaches, marinas, hotels, the whole vacation package. The sea was full of fish. Birds migrated there by the millions. It seemed like this accidental sea had become a thriving ecosystem. But here's the problem with creating a sea in the desert where one isn't supposed to be. There's no outlet. Water flows in from agricultural runoff and a few rivers, but it doesn't flow out. The only way water leaves is through evaporation. And when water evaporates, it leaves everything else behind. Minerals, agricultural chemicals, everything just accumulates. By the 1970s, things started going wrong. The salt concentration kept increasing. Fish started dying. Not just a few fish. Mass die-offs involving millions of fish. The beaches became graveyards of rotting tilapia. The smell was unbearable. Tourists stopped coming. The resorts closed down. The yacht clubs became ghost towns. Within a generation, the California Riviera turned into an apocalyptic wasteland. The salt wasn't even the worst part. Agricultural runoff brings fertilizers, which means nitrogen and phosphorus. These nutrients feed algae blooms. The algae dies. Bacteria decompose it. And that process sucks oxygen out of the water. You end up with hypoxic zones, areas where there's not enough oxygen for fish to survive. Add in pesticides, heavy metals, and other industrial chemicals from decades of agricultural use, and you've got a toxic soup. By the early 2000s, the Salton Sea was in a death spiral. The water level was dropping about a foot per year. As the waterline receded, it exposed lakebed that had been underwater for decades. That lakebed is coated with all those accumulated chemicals and dried salt. The desert wind picks it up and creates dust storms that blow through nearby communities. We're talking about toxic dust containing arsenic, selenium, and who knows what else. People living near the sea have some of the highest asthma rates in California. The bird populations crashed too. The Salton Sea used to be one of the most important stops on the Pacific Flyway, the migration route for birds traveling between Alaska and South America. Over 400 species of birds used to stop there. Bird numbers had dropped by more than 90%. The few birds that did show up often died from avian botulism outbreaks caused by bacteria thriving in the warm, salty water. But fixing the Salton Sea seemed impossible. You can't just add fresh water. There isn't enough fresh water in Southern California to spare. You can't drain it. Where would the water go? And even if you could drain it, you'd expose even more toxic lakebed. Every solution they looked at cost billions of dollars and might not even work. Then in 2017, a marine biologist named Dr. Patricia Rodriguez had what everyone else thought was a crazy idea. She'd been studying the Humboldt squid, a species found along the Pacific coast of the Americas. These squids are weird, adaptable, and tough as hell. They live in a range of conditions that would kill most marine life. They can handle low oxygen levels that would suffocate fish. They reproduce fast. And here's the key part. They're voracious predators that eat almost anything. Rodriguez proposed introducing Humboldt squid to the Salton Sea. The immediate reaction from other scientists was basically, "Are you insane? Introducing non-native species to ecosystems is how you create disasters, not solve them. Look at Asian carp in the Great Lakes. Look at pythons in the Everglades." Every biologist learns in their first semester that you don't just dump random species into ecosystems and hope for the best. But Rodriguez had done her homework. The Salton Sea was already dead. There was no ecosystem left to disrupt. Whatever they tried couldn't make it worse. And the squid might, emphasis on might, address some of the core problems. They could eat the dying fish before they rotted and created oxygen-depleting bacteria blooms. They could survive in conditions that nothing else could tolerate. And if it worked, even partially, it would buy time to develop longer-term solutions. Getting approval took 2 years. Environmental groups opposed it. Local communities were skeptical. State regulators demanded endless studies and impact assessments. And eventually, she got a green light for a pilot program. Not millions of squid right away. They started small. In March 2019. They released 50,000 juvenile Humboldt squid into the Salton Sea. The squid were bred in captivity at a facility in San Diego, specifically adapted over several generations to tolerate higher salinity and different water chemistry. They weren't just grabbing squid from the ocean and dumping them in. These were squid that had been prepared for this environment. The first few months were tense. The scientist monitoring the project had no idea if the squid would even survive. The salinity was higher than anything Humboldt squid normally dealt with. The water chemistry was all wrong. The temperature fluctuated wildly between day and night. If the squid just died, the whole experiment was over before it started. But the squid didn't die. They survived. And then they did something unexpected. They thrived. Within 6 months, the squid population had grown. They were reproducing in the Salton Sea. Sonar surveys showed squid spreading throughout the water. They were eating everything. Dying tilapia, algae, smaller invertebrates, basically anything organic they could find. Encouraged by these early results, the program expanded. They released another 200,000 squid. In 2021, 500,000 more. By 2022, they were releasing squid in batches of 1 million at a time. The total number of squid introduced between 2019 and 2023 was somewhere around 4.5 million. Nobody knows exactly how many squid are in the Salton Sea now because they're reproducing on their own, but estimates put it at over 15 million. Here's where it gets really interesting. The squid started changing their behavior in ways that surprised everyone. Humboldt squid in the ocean are generally solitary hunters, but in the Salton Sea, they started exhibiting coordinated hunting behavior. They were working together in groups to herd fish, using tactics that researchers had never seen before. It was like the extreme environment was forcing them to adapt and develop new survival strategies. The bird populations started recovering. This was completely unexpected. Scientists thought it would take decades for birds to return even if water quality improved. But by 2021, bird counts started going up. Species that hadn't been seen at the Salton Sea in years were showing up again. White pelicans, which had abandoned the sea in the 1990s, came back in numbers not seen in 30 years. Why were the birds coming back? The squid. It turns out that squid, especially young squid, are an excellent food source for fish-eating birds. The squid population explosion created a new food web that could support bird populations. Pelicans were diving for squid. Cormorants were feeding on them. Even species that don't normally eat squid were adapting to take advantage of this new food source. But the most insane result didn't show up until 2023. The water clarity improved. The Salton Sea had been murky and opaque for decades. Visibility measured in inches. By late 2023, visibility in some areas reached several feet. You could actually see into the water. Scientists initially thought their equipment was malfunctioning. They ran tests multiple times to confirm it. The leading theory is that the squid were consuming so much organic material that algae blooms couldn't establish themselves the way they used to. Less algae means clearer water. Clearer water means more sunlight penetrates deeper, which allows different types of beneficial bacteria and microorganisms to establish themselves. It's a positive feedback loop. The squid created conditions that allowed other life to return, which improved conditions further. The salinity is still too high. The chemical contamination is still a problem. Nobody's pretending the Salton Sea is suddenly clean. But it's better. Measurably, significantly better than it was 5 years ago. The rate of decline has slowed. In some metrics, the decline has stopped entirely. That alone is remarkable. Local communities started noticing changes too. The smell improved. The Salton Sea still doesn't smell great. You're not going to confuse it with fresh mountain air, but it's not the overwhelming rotten egg stench it used to be. The dust storms are less frequent because the exposed lake bed is being covered by water again as agricultural runoff continues flowing in. Air quality in nearby towns like Bombay Beach and Salton City has improved. There have been complications, obviously. Introducing millions of squid into an ecosystem creates new problems even as it solves old ones. The squid eat everything, including fish species that people were trying to preserve. There were still some populations of desert pupfish, an endangered species, living in tributaries feeding into the Salton Sea. Some of those populations have been impacted by squid predation. The squid also die. Millions of them. Humboldt squid don't live very long, usually just a year or two. When they die, they decompose, which should theoretically create the same oxygen depletion problem that dead fish caused. But somehow it's not happening to the same degree. The working theory is that the squid population is large enough that other squid eat the dead ones before they can decompose. Squid cannibalism is solving the decomposition problem. Nature is weird. There's also the question of what happens if the squid population crashes. Right now they're booming because there's abundant food. But what happens when they eat through all the available food? Do they starve? Does the population stabilize at some sustainable level? Nobody knows. This is all unprecedented. Some environmental groups are still opposed to the whole thing. They argue that introducing squid is a band-aid solution that doesn't address the root causes of the Salton Sea's problems. They're not wrong. The agricultural runoff is still happening. The water is still evaporating. The fundamental issues that created the crisis haven't been solved. But Rodriguez and her team argue that the squid are buying time. Every year the Salton Sea doesn't get catastrophically worse, is a year to develop better solutions. And maybe, just maybe, the squid are showing that nature is more resilient and adaptable than we give it credit for. Given the right conditions, even a dying ecosystem can start to recover. The economic impact has been unexpected too. Tourists are coming back. Not in huge numbers. And they're not building new yacht clubs. But there's a small but growing ecotourism industry around squid watching. Boat tour operators take people out at night with lights to observe the squid. They're bioluminescent, which means they glow in the dark, and watching millions of glowing squid in the middle of the desert is apparently quite the spectacle. Fishermen have started showing up too. Not to catch squid. Those are protected under the program regulations, but to catch the fish that are returning to feed on squid eggs and juveniles. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife is cautiously allowing limited fishing with strict catch limits. It's not much, but it's the first time in decades that fishing at the Salton Sea has been viable at all. The scientific community is paying close attention. If the Salton Sea continues to recover with squid as a keystone species in the new ecosystem, it could change how we approach environmental restoration globally. There are dying bodies of water all over the world. Drying lakes, polluted estuaries, collapsing fisheries. The traditional approach is to try to restore them to their original state, which is expensive and often impossible. The Salton Sea Squid Program represents a different philosophy, except that the original ecosystem is gone. It's not coming back. Instead, create a new ecosystem that can function in the current conditions, even if those conditions are far from ideal. It's pragmatic. It's cheaper, and if it works, it's effective. There are risks with this approach. Creating novel ecosystems with non-native species can have unpredictable consequences. The squid could escape to other bodies of water. They could outcompete native species in ways we don't anticipate. They could introduce diseases. The long-term effects might not show up for decades. Every scientist involved acknowledges these risks. But the counter-argument is simple. Doing nothing wasn't working. The Salton Sea was dying, and it was taking the surrounding communities and ecosystems with it. Trying something radical, even if it might fail, was better than watching the slow-motion disaster continue. As of early 2024, the program is being studied for possible expansion to other locations. The Great Salt Lake in Utah is facing similar problems to the Salton Sea: shrinking water levels, increasing salinity, toxic dust from exposed lakebed. Researchers are investigating whether a modified version of the squid program could work there. The biology is different, the chemistry is different, but the core concept might translate. There's also interest from international organizations. The Aral Sea is shrunk to a fraction of its former size due to Soviet irrigation projects. It's an environmental catastrophe on a scale that makes the Salton Sea look manageable. If squid or some other hardy species could be introduced to create a functioning ecosystem in the remaining water, it could help millions of people living in the affected region. The Salton Sea still has a long way to go. It's not saved. It might never be truly healthy in the way we traditionally define healthy ecosystems. The salinity will probably keep increasing. The chemical contamination isn't going away without massive remediation efforts that nobody wants to pay for. But it's not dead anymore either. It's something new, something we don't have a good name for yet. A hybrid ecosystem, part natural and part engineered, functioning in conditions that shouldn't support life but somehow do. Dr. Rodriguez, who started all of this with what seemed like a crazy idea, has become something of a celebrity in environmental science circles. She gives talks around the world about adaptive ecosystem management and working with nature instead of against it. She's careful not to oversell what's been accomplished. And experiments can fail. But so far, against all odds, it's working. The biggest lesson from the Salton Sea might be about flexibility. We've spent decades trying to restore ecosystems to some idealized past state, often with limited success and enormous cost. Maybe the future of environmental restoration isn't about going backwards. Maybe it's about accepting change and working to create new ecosystems that can thrive in our changed world. The squid didn't save the Salton Sea by making it what it used to be. They created something different, something that works. If you want to see more stories about environmental science and restoration projects that actually work, hit subscribe. More videos coming soon.